Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's presentation on when is it time, understanding the euthanasia window. So we try to aim for an hour for this presentation. Historically, it has run a little long, about an hour 15, hour and 20. You will receive a link to the recording automatically as soon as the event is over, where you can watch a replay. So if you feel like you need to step away for whatever reason, that's perfectly okay. You'll be able to kind of pick up where you left off. I will answer questions at the end of the webinar today. I cannot answer any medical questions. I'm not a veterinarian, but I will certainly answer whatever questions that I can. And so feel free to ask those in the questions tab in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. So let me start by telling you a little bit about myself. So my name is Mike Hodge. I, along with my wife, Dr. Kendra Hodge, own Healing Touch. Healing Touch provides in-home euthanasia and quality of life consultations to the eastern Wisconsin, Fox Valley areas, the Appleton, West Bend, Manitowoc, Sheboygan areas. We believe in empowering owners and taking a holistic approach to this process. So making sure that we are providing owners the information that they need to feel empowered as they navigate this incredibly difficult chapter of their pet's life. And that's one of the big motivating factors behind why we wanted to do this presentation. We see how confusing this process can be. We know how difficult this process can be. And we wanted to provide this presentation as a way of providing some support so that you have the information that you need to make the best decisions for you and your family. As I mentioned, I'm not a veterinarian. I'm a companion animal doula. So what that means is my job is less about the medical side of this process and more about helping owners and supporting them through the emotional, the practical, and the logistical kind of realities of these decisions and how to think about these things. Have a couple of goals for today's presentation. The first is to introduce this concept of the euthanasia window and sort of talk about why, if we think about it as a window versus a moment of time, how that can be really, really helpful in terms of both planning and processing kind of through this decision-making process, but also just kind of gives you a different way, a different perspective to kind of think about things and take some of the pressure off looking for the exact right moment to make the decision. We're going to talk about all the factors beyond just the medical factors that are going to kind of influence where you may fall within this window. And we're going to provide some tools that can help you navigate the in-between. So how do you support your pet through this chapter of their life? And what are the things that you can do to kind of help ensure that you're meeting the goals that you set forth for you and your pet? Now, before we begin, it's important to acknowledge that conversations around this topic, they're difficult. They're difficult for everyone, not just us as pet owners. They're also difficult for our veterinarians, right? So these conversations are hard to have, and I hope that this presentation will also give you some dialogue that you can share with your veterinarian and some ways to approach those conversations with your veterinarian so that, again, you can meet the goals that you have set out for your this chapter of your pet's life. But conversations are difficult. And as we navigate through this webinar and as you think about this in the coming days, weeks, and months, a lot of emotions are going to be brought up, and that's okay. Don't be surprised if that is the case, and allow yourself to feel whatever it is that you need to feel. Fred Rogers said that anything's human is mentionable, and anything that's mentionable can be more manageable. When we can talk about our feelings, they become less overwhelming, less upsetting, and less scary. All right. You're only here because you love your pet. Nobody would sit through a presentation like this if they didn't care deeply about your pet. So let's just keep that in the forefront of our minds as we go through this. So we're going to start by having a little bit of a hard conversation. We're going to talk about denial. And we often, like most of us will know that denial is like the first stage of the grieving process. But one thing you may not be aware of is that denial begins even before the death has occurred. The grieving process begins before the death has occurred. And we call the grief that occurs before the death anticipatory grief, or grief in anticipation of the death. All right. And we think of denial as this bad thing, right? But it's important to acknowledge that denial has some benefits. Denial is inherently protective. Okay. And so the denial is a shield from what we know is going to be a very difficult thing to go through emotionally. So it's important. And the reason why we present this here in the beginning of this presentation is because in our experience with reference to the goals that most owners have for their pets into life, a lot of owners aren't acting soon enough. And it's not because they don't love their pet. It's just that decline is painful, and seeing that decline is painful. And again, our brains are naturally attuned to wanting to sort of minimize the negative, that decline that we see in our pet, and sort of elevate the things that are going well. You know, your pet's eating for the first time in a couple of days, right? Maybe they're walking around and they're moving in a way that they haven't been able to do. And so our brain is going to elevate that and kind of cling to, look, they're doing great, they're doing okay. And the problem is that if we don't acknowledge this as a possibility, and you don't have to necessarily fix it, just sort of knowing that this is something that could occur does a lot to offset that and to just keep that in the back of your mind. And so by acknowledging that this is a possibility, we're not saying that you should euthanize sooner. What we're saying is that this gives you the opportunity to create space for the decision, okay? And to prevent a situation where you end up in a place where you don't want to be, which for a lot of families and a lot of owners that we talk to, that place is the emergency room in an emergency euthanasia. So this idea of a window does helps us break through this sort of quote unquote denial wall a little earlier. Again, not to rush the decision, but simply to create the space for it and to allow you to plan. One of the things that we often will tell owners is that when you're making the decision to euthanize, the fear that's there, usually the predominant fear is this idea of like, I'm choosing for my pet to die. And I think it's very important to sort of dispel that. You're not choosing when you make a decision to euthanize for your pet to die. That decision has already been made. Their disease, their age, their prognosis, time, the gift of life itself also means that they will die. So when you're making the decision here, as hard of a decision as it is, you're not making the decision if they will die. What you are making is the decision about how, right? And it's a small way, it's a small reframe in terms of how we think about it. But we have found, and the owners that we work with have found, that if they can kind of shift the way they view that perspective from, as much as I don't want this to happen, if it has to happen, this is how I'd like it to happen. What can happen as a result of that is there's going to be a little more peace at that process, and it's going to allow you to maintain a little bit more control over how this process actually plays out. So how do I know when it's time? Hands down, one of the most common questions that I get asked. And the problem is that even as a society, we're not talking about this in the ways that we should be talking about it, right? So usually when you mention that to somebody, their response is something along the lines of, oh, you'll just know, or they'll give you some sign, or wait till they're done eating and drinking, or all of these things that are coming from a good place, right? An intent to help, but aren't actually helpful. And what happens as a result is that owners are looking for this perfect moment to make the decision. And when they don't find that perfect moment, or they wait so long that looking for it that they end up in the emergency room, now they've had an experience that is traumatic and more painful than it might have been otherwise. And so the question isn't, when is the right moment? So it's not a moment, it's a window. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, the euthanasia window and how to view this. So what do I mean by that? So the euthanasia window is a way to describe a period of time where the decision to euthanize is a humane and ethically appropriate choice. Okay, it's a spectrum, it's a continuum. It's if you were to looking at this graphic here, on the left side of this spectrum, we have comfort, right? Early on in the senior years of your pet, early on in the disease prognosis of your pet, their comfort is at its highest. Okay. And as time goes on, as we tick closer and closer towards time, which at the farthest end of the time spectrum is a natural death, as we tick towards that, their comfort's going to decrease, and the time that you get with them is going to increase. So the first thing to kind of think about is, where on the spectrum do you kind of inherently fall? The other way to look at this window is not just about where you decide that you want to be. Oh, I want more comfort for my pet, or I need more time with my pet. But this also, again, kind of describes that natural progression that your pet itself is going to go through. Now, we can't give you an exact time frame for how long this window lasts. That's largely dictated by the disease, and we'll talk about some of that more when we get to the medical factors. But I do want you to know that there's no right answer here, rather a range of circumstances that make it medically appropriate. And within that space, there's a combination of factors that can make the decision as peaceful as it can be for all involved. But it's important to know that it's never, ever going to be an easy decision. So let's look at the comfort side of the scale. Now, what you're going to see as we go through this presentation is that a lot of this is risk analysis, right? And so this is really a matter of us identifying the risks of both sides of the spectrum, the comfort side and the time side, and figuring out, where you individually fall. On the comfort side of the spectrum, it's an earlier intervention, right? You're making the decision to euthanize a little earlier. And as a result of that, that does mean we're going to have a lower risk of an emergency event and a lower risk of discomfort for our pet. But it does allow you a little more control, again, over the process, who you want there, where it's going to happen, those sorts of things. But it's not all good, right? There's less time together, which is going to mean that you're going to have more uncertainty, a lot more questions. Is this the right time? Is this not the right time? And it is going to be harder on you because of that uncertainty, right? So that's just something to keep in mind. On the time side of the spectrum here, it's a later intervention. So you are going to get more time together with your pet. There is going to be a little less uncertainty about the decision because some of those medical factors are going to become so apparent that we can't ignore them anymore. But there is a higher risk of an emergency event and higher risk of discomfort, and you run the risk of having less control. As I said, though, it is a little easier on the owner, right? And why do I say that? So imagine waking up in the morning and you look at your pet and they're in a bad way, whatever that is. Maybe they've had a massive stroke. Maybe they're really struggling to catch their breath, or they're just clearly in a lot of pain. And you make the decision, you say, hey, I've got to take them to the emergency room. We have to do this now. Okay. That is certainly going to be a hard experience for a lot of reasons, but at least in terms of the decision itself, it is a little easier because, like I said, those medical factors are so apparent that we can't deny them anymore. And so there's trade-offs here on both ends of these spectrums. And the thing to know is that there's no right or wrong answers. Where you fall on that spectrum is deeply personal and deeply unique. And it is perfectly okay to say, I need as much time with my pet as I can, and I'm aware of the risks of that, and I'm going to try to manage their comfort and keep them as comfortable as I can. It's also okay to say, hey, listen, I don't want my pet to experience that discomfort, and therefore I'm going to fall more on the comfort side of the scale. Most families typically fall somewhere in the middle. But again, it's unique and personal and different for everybody involved. So looking at that spectrum and that scale, the question to ask yourself is, what matters more to you, right? Are you more hoping to maximize comfort or maximize time? And again, there's no right or wrong answer there. There are a multitude of factors, as you're going to see, that are going to influence where you fall. And the decision as to where you want to fall very likely will change over time and may be different for each person involved in the decision-making process. So that's just something to consider as you navigate that window with your pet. Now, this is where this conversation gets a little hard, because this is where I'm asking you to take a look at your pet and evaluate the information that you have and try to determine, like, is your pet within the window? Now, it is important to know, before I say anything more, that if you have doubts, this is where discussing this with a veterinary professional is important before you make any final decisions. The other thing I want you to know, and if you hear nothing else, I want you to hear this: being within the window does not mean you have to act immediately. As I said in the beginning, just because they're in the window, we don't have to act. We're just trying to create space for the decision and space to evaluate the things that are going to influence that decision. So how do you know if your pet's within the window? Well, there can be some more obvious things to think about. So your pet might be within the window if they've been diagnosed with a terminal or life-limiting illness, or if your veterinarian has recommended treatment that you're unable or choosing not to pursue. If your vet started using words with you like palliative care, hospice care, comfort, that can be a sign that they're kind of getting to the point where they might be within the window. If you yourself are starting to think about, comfort or palliative care or hospice type care, or you're starting to really think about quality of life for more than just like this, like theoretical thing, like you're actively starting to evaluate it and monitor it, like that could be a sign that, again, your pet is within the window. But again, if you have any questions or if you're unsure, this is where having that conversation with your veterinarian is really, really important. So we talked about the window. Now we're going to take some time to talk about the factors that might influence where you fall within that window. And the first of which, and probably arguably the most important, are your goals. So what is it that you are trying to achieve? So take some time to think about, what do I want out of this chapter of my pet's life? Are you hoping to maximize comfort at the cost of potentially less time together? Or are you hoping to maximize time, accepting a higher risk of decline or an emergency? Maybe you're somewhere in the middle. Are you adamant about avoiding an emergency situation so that you can maintain more control over the process? As I said, who's going to be there? What kind of memories where that you'd like to do, like a reading of a poem or a saying of a prayer? Where does this process occur? If you're looking for a in-home versus an in-clinic versus a natural death, that all will kind of play into that decision-making process. One thing I do want to just kind of note about a natural death is that it's not, when you make the choice to allow for a natural death, you're not just making the choice to allow them to pass on their own. I want to emphasize that if you are hoping to achieve a natural death for your pet, and that's I've got nothing philosophically against a natural death. I just want you to be aware that there are a lot of things you got to think about, and it is going to require a lot of additional work on you to make sure that you're managing comfort, you're keeping track of things, and you could still potentially end up in a situation where you're still in an ER making the decision because in the midst of that natural dying process, something goes sideways, and you want to give your pet some relief. So you just need to be aware of that if you're thinking about a natural death. So all of these things are going to kind of play into where exactly you want to fall. But like I said, it's hard either way. And in a lot of ways, you got to choose your hard, right? Which is going to be harder to deal with after the fact. The uncertainty about the time left or the certainty that they didn't suffer unnecessarily. Like I said, it's never going to be easy, but only you and your family know what will be easier for you to come to peace with after the fact. So although we're going to be talking about a lot of factors beyond just the medical, we have to acknowledge the medical, right? That's the reason why they're within the window. That's the reason why you might be attending this presentation. So we have to kind of acknowledge these. And the medical factors do greatly influence the window. The disease trajectory plays a big part in how wide that window is, how much time you have from maximum comfort to that natural death at the end of the maximum time side of the spectrum. Okay, so some diseases like chronic disease or chronic kidney disease can extend that window out because that disease is just slower acting, and you might be able to catch it early on in the disease process. Other diseases like osteosarcoma or bone cancer are harder to detect. And so you may not detect the disease until they're already very late in the window. And it may be a rapidly progressive disease, meaning that that window is going to be severely shortened. And so that's something that you got to kind of think about and something you're going to have to kind of evaluate. The predictability of the disease, meaning like what kind of comfort, what kind of quality of life does my pet have on a regular basis, right? How predictable is it? Diseases that are unpredictable, things where like they're having like massive seizure events, but we don't know when exactly they happen. They just seem to be seemingly random. They're occurring when they do happen. They're pretty bad. That's harder to manage, and that's harder. That makes this process even harder than, say, something that like kidney disease, where the decline is more linear and progressive over time. So that predictability plays a big role into it. Same thing with treatment options. The type of treatment options that are available, that are effective, and that your pet will tolerate are going to have some influence on where exactly you fall within the window. Some treatment options aren't even curative, right? They're just supportive. And some come with such bad side effects that you may evaluate that, like, hey, listen, that's not really an avenue worth pursuing, or we don't feel like that's something we should pursue. So as a result of that, you're going to be more focused on that comfort and monitoring that to make sure that you're keeping them comfortable. So the type of treatment options that you have available is going to play a big part in that. And so does the type of supportive care that you have. If you're able to get pain management, appetite stimulants, mobility aids, those kind of things, if you have access to those things, then that will kind of naturally allow you to extend a little more into the time side of the window because you're adequately able to manage the comfort side as well and to keep them, feeling as good as we can keep them feeling. So all of these things are going to play a big role in sort of you evaluating, hey, based on what my conditions my pet actually has and what they're struggling with right now, where do we want to fall within that window? Access to care plays a big part in the decision-making process. A family that lives near an emergency room that's open 24 hours a day and is usually accepting patients, that's a different calculus, right, than somebody that lives further away. We're in the Sheboygan, Plymouth area where the nearest ER is going to be in Appleton or Grafton, Port Washington, right, Green Bay. It's an hour, 45 minutes in the car, and that's a long time for your pet to be, in a situation where they're clearly uncomfortable. And so that, just your physical proximity to veterinary care is going to dictate where exactly you may want to fall in the window, and you're going to have to compare that to your goals, because if you want to avoid that emergency room and you live further away, you may have to make the decision a little sooner just to ensure that that's the case. Same thing with in-home hospice or euthanasia. If you're looking for that sort of end-of-life experience for your pet, that's going to kind of dictate where it is that you fall in the window. If you have access to in-home hospice, which isn't terribly common in vet med, but if you do have access to it, then that can allow you to extend some of that quality time without the stress of taking your pet to the veterinary office. And then finally, your vet team matters as well. Do you have access to quality of life consultations? Are you able to use them as a guide to ensure that you have that support that you need in order to keep a monitor on things at home, especially? Your pet's traits are going to play into the decision-making process because every pet is inherently different. Some pets mask pain and or never stop eating despite the decline. And I often will kind of joke that if you have a cat that's been hiding illness from you for the last 15 years of its life, the odds of it all of a sudden being, open and transparent about what it's going through is, Probably not very high, right? And that's hard because they can't sit down and have a conversation with us. They can't tell us what they're going through and what they're experiencing. That we have to rely on historical information there in order to make these decisions. How have they been when they were kind of in their prime, and how does that compare to what they're doing now? So personality plays a big part of that. Same with ease of care. There are some pets that, you just can't easily medicate them. And that's problematic. And if you've got a disease that requires a lot of trips to the vet for monitoring, like blood work and things like that, and every time you go to get them in the car to get them to the vet to get that blood work, it's this huge ordeal that's stressful for you and your pet. It's okay that kind of influences, again, where you want to fall in the window, because we have to manage the disease so that we can keep them comfortable. So that's going to play in. Size of the animal matters, especially when you're dealing with large pets that might have mobility issues, because it's just going to require a lot more physical strength for you to be able to transport them and care for them. And their age matters too. With a younger pet, you may be more willing to pursue a more aggressive treatment than an older pet. But not only that, younger pets are going to be more tolerant of an aggressive form of treatment compared to an older pet, right? And as they get older, especially, a lot of the conditions, again, aren't curative. We can't fix them. It's more about monitoring and management, and more of that palliative care type support. So all of these factors are going to kind of play in your decision-making process as to, hey, where exactly, based on this information, do I want to fall? Now, the next couple of slides we're going to talk about are personal factors. And this is one of the trickiest parts to navigate. So in our experience with the families that we've helped, we find that these are the factors that are most often overlooked and are the most common causes for owners not being able to realize their goals for their pet's end-of-life experience. Now, we're not saying that you should only consider your circumstances when making this decision, but it is important to acknowledge these factors, right? These factors, and acknowledging those factors, don't make you selfish. It just allows you to be prepared and honest about the situation that you find yourself in. You can't pour from an empty cup, and as noble as it may seem to ignore your own needs, life is full of limitations and complications, right? So by giving careful and honest consideration to these factors, it allows you to be better prepared for the realities that you find yourself in. So the first of which is the owner physical factors. Now, why does this matter? Well, your physical capacity does affect what kind of care that you're able to provide. If you're struggling because of mobility or strength issues or age, if you're struggling to lift your pet to get them to the vet, like that's going to play into the decision-making process. If you're dealing with your own health battles yourself, and you've got your own chronic conditions, injuries, disabilities, what have you, that limit the kind of care that you are able to provide, that's not a shortcoming on your part. It's just the reality that we find ourselves in. And so it's okay. It's not selfish. It is okay for those factors to influence that decision-making process. And what kind of support system do you have? That matters. If you are struggling with mobility or age or chronic health conditions or what have you, but you have a good support system that's able to kind of help care for your pet, then that's wonderful, right? And that makes a difference in terms of like what you're able to provide. So family, friends, neighbors, if you have that support system, that's going to kind of influence that decision-making process. What else is going on in your life influences it as well. We often feel very selfish for this part. And there's often a lot of guilt around these things. But again, it's important to acknowledge that these things do matter, and they're gonna matter either way, whether we acknowledge them or not. So for me, I view it as it's better to acknowledge them so that we can just come to more acceptance of the fact that this is a reality that we find ourselves in, and gives yourself a little grace in the process. So your life demands are going to matter, right? Are you caregiving for children or aging parents? Do you have a lot of work responsibilities or major life events like weddings or funerals or things coming up that are going to influence things, right? That's okay. How much emotional space or how much space do you have on your plate right now? How much emotional bandwidth is available? It's okay that you don't have a lot right now, right? And it's okay to try to wait until maybe you do have a little more emotional bandwidth to kind of tackle this decision, but you got to be aware of what the risks are by making that decision. And if you're okay with those risks, like this whole entire webinar, if you're okay with the risk, that's okay. We just want you thinking about it. Financial resources. I hear this one a lot. It is okay to say, because of the cost, I am electing not to pursue treatment based on all the factors that I'm taking in, one of which is the cost of that. That doesn't make you a bad owner. Doesn't make you selfish. Again, it's just the reality that you find yourself in. It's also okay to not have the financial resources to pursue some of these treatments as well. You know, society is very quick to cast judgment and say, oh, if you have a pet, you've got to spend every penny on them to ensure that you're caring for them. Well, that's just not a fair reality that we find ourselves in. So it is okay. It is okay to elect not to pursue treatment because of finances. It is okay to simply not have the money to pursue the treatment because of the finances. You know, at the end of the day, I think what your pet cares most about is the love that you show them. And you don't have to, have a ton of money to be able to show your pet that love. You do the best you can with what you've got. All right. And that also applies to our living situation. It's okay if you have a pet with mobility issues and you live on that 3rd-story apartment. Hey, winter's coming up, it's getting cold, those mobility issues are going to kind of exacerbate themselves, and it's okay for you to make that decision to say, hey, listen, I know that with these stairs and my pet's condition and the risk of them slipping and falling and breaking something and ending up in the ER, that I don't want that risk to occur, and so I'm going to make the decision maybe a little sooner. That's perfectly okay, right? Again, these are all things that we just have to evaluate as we're navigating this. Your values and beliefs are going to play a big part in where you decide to fall as a family within the window. When it comes to religious beliefs, there are some faiths that have specific teachings about euthanasia that can create tension. And I would encourage you that if you subscribe to a belief where that is the case, and you're struggling with some of that tension in between those religious beliefs and what you're looking to do with your pet, it's not uncommon, right? But reach out to a faith leader and talk to them about what it is that you're experiencing. I personally choose to believe that intent matters, and we're not making this decision out of malice. We're making this decision out of love. And I have to believe that matters, and that has to be taken into consideration. But again, I'm not an expert in your particular faith. So reach out to your faith leaders and have the conversations with them and allow them to help guide you through this process. Your beliefs in quality versus quantity of life matter. Again, more of that, what matters more to you, time or comfort. Your afterlife beliefs can play into it. I sometimes have owners that'll tell me, Mike, I'm really, really worried that if I make this decision, that my pet is going to somehow judge me. They're going to be judged in the afterlife, that their pet's going to be upset with that decision. And I often will have to remind owners, and I believe this firmly in the bottom of my heart, okay? I think that if after the decision is made, your pet could sit down with you and have a conversation, I firmly believe that they would thank you. I think they would thank you for the bond that you've created. I think they'd thank you for the memories that you guys have shared, for all the care that you provided. And yes, I do think that they would thank you for the gift, and it is a gift, of a peaceful death, surrounded by those that love them the most. May we all be so lucky. And if that's hard for you to believe, I would encourage you just to think about your pet as they are now, right? Our pets are always providing comfort to us. I could step on my dog's tail and he'll immediately turn around and give me kisses as if to say, I'm so sorry that I was somehow in your way, right? So I have to believe that they would also be providing that comfort to me after they've passed, okay? Because it's just what they've always done. Finally, the good day philosophy. So what do I mean by that? So the good day philosophy is asking you to evaluate how comfortable are you with choosing euthanasia while your pet is still having good days. Okay, and again, it's okay to be on either side of that. But let's run through a little thought exercise. So again, you wake up in the morning, today is the day. You've made the decision, you have it scheduled with your veterinarian that today is the day you're going to euthanize. And you wake up and you look at your pet and wow, they're doing great, right? They're, like I said, maybe they're eating and they haven't eaten in a while. They look comfortable, right? They don't seem like they're maybe in as much pain as maybe you've seen them in the past, right? So they're having, by whatever means you choose to qualify it, a good day. So you make the decision to euthanize. What is that experience going to be like for you? And what is that experience going to be like for your pet? For you, it's going to be harder, right? Because again, our brains are going to cling to that good moment. We elevate the good, we minimize the negative, right? So our brains are going to kind of cling to that, and it's going to be a harder decision for you, hands down, right? What is that decision like for your pet? Their last day was a good one. They were feeling better than maybe they felt in a little while. Okay, so that's something to think about. Let's flip the script. You wake up and it's pretty clear that today is a rough day for your pet, and today is the day that it has to happen, right? What's that like for you, and what's that like for your pet? For you, like I said earlier, the decision might be a little bit easier just because some of these medical factors are so apparent that we can't ignore them anymore. But for your pet, they're having a pretty rough day. They're having a pretty rough day. And so it's okay to be either side of that. There's no judgment here. It's just what feels right and feels best for you. Your feelings are going to kind of evolve as your pet goes through the window, but they can sometimes give you some clues as to where exactly in the window you fall. So oftentimes, early in the window, these are where we start asking ourselves questions like, is it too soon? Am I giving up on them? Am I, quote unquote, betraying them by making this decision? Am I giving up copious amounts of time? These are all very common fears. I have two anecdotes to share with you that if you're feeling that way, I hope will provide some comfort. The first of which is that in our doctor's experience, we have two veterinarians here at Healing Touch, and I've talked to both of them extensively about this question. Now, nobody can give an exact answer, of course. Nobody has a crystal ball to know, hey, your pet has exactly 3 days, 4 hours, and 10 minutes left, right? But in their medical opinion, based on the families that they've helped and the cases that they've seen, oftentimes owners are not making a decision so early that they are giving up copious amounts of natural time left. It's not as if owners are typically making this decision where they're giving up years of life or months of life. Oftentimes it's weeks, sometimes it's days, and we've had a couple of cases where it was mere minutes, or and so that's one thing just to be aware of. The other thing is in the 1,000+ families that I've helped counsel through this decision-making process, I've never once had somebody call me back and say, Mike, you know what? In hindsight, now that it's all said and done, I really wish I would have made the decision later. I've never heard that, not once. I can tell you that almost on a weekly basis, I have owners telling me that I wish I would have made the decision sooner in hindsight. Now, that doesn't make the decision easier for you, but it does, I hope, provide some context there to just think about as you're wrestling with these things. And again, that's very normal to wrestle with these things. What kind of, later in the window, this is where we're going to be thinking and often hearing things from owners about, like, am I being selfish for keeping them here? Have I waited too long? Or I feel guilty because I feel some relief to think that this is going to be over soon. Anytime I have an owner tell me, Mike, I feel like I'm being selfish for keeping them here, I always have to try to stop them there and just pause the conversation. It is not selfish to want more time with your pet. Who doesn't want more time with their pet, right? It's not selfish to want that time. It's human to want that time. That does mean you got to kind of accept some of these other risks, and it might require a little more diligence to make sure we're keeping them comfortable and things like that, but it's not selfish to want more time. Again, it's human. When you have a pet, you have a bond with them that is so deep, that it's only natural to want to keep that around for as long as possible. Okay, so it doesn't make you selfish. Like I said, it just makes you human. What kind of preparation have you had to think about this decision? Sometimes we take our pet to the vet and we have this idea when we're going into the vet that, like, oh, this is minor, right? Maybe it's a UTI or some, arthritis or some, they just need a little pain meds or an antibiotic and they'll be okay. And then you sit down with the veterinarian and you have the conversation. And they start talking about cancer and prognosis and, time to live and euthanasia. And all of a sudden, everything that they have said is going away, right? You're in a daze. You're in shock as you're trying to reel with this new reality that has literally just been thrust upon you. And it sometimes happens where, like, you walk in thinking it's one thing, and while you're there, the veterinarian makes it clear that, like, in their medical opinion, this euthanasia needs to happen, and it needs to happen as soon as possible, right? And that's just a lot. That's a lot. And if that's happened to you, I'm so sorry, because that is a lot to process and work through. Now, one thing I will say is, if you find yourself in that situation where that is the case, I would encourage you, to the best of your ability, to just have a conversation with your veterinarian. It is okay to ask your veterinarian, is there something that we can do to keep my pet comfortable for just maybe a day or two? And you'd be amazed how often even just a day can go towards making it easier for you to come to terms with what's happening. All right. So don't be afraid to ask for that time and say, hey, listen, I hear what you're saying. This euthanasia needs to happen right away. But is there anything that we can do to get them through the weekend so that way I can, just come to terms with it? Can we keep them comfortable? Can we manage this in a way that I can have the time that I need, but also my pet's not going to suffer unnecessarily because of it? Oftentimes there is. Oftentimes there is. And there may not be. But at least then, if there's not, you've asked. You've had the conversation, and you're going to go forward knowing that, as tragic as this situation was, you at least knew. If you don't ask, that's where that potential to sit there and think about that a week later, 2 weeks later, is going to kick in. Hey, could I have gotten just another day or two? Right? Could I have gotten more time for my friends or family to say goodbye? Right? So it's better to ask, even if that answer is no, than to not ask. And it's really hard because in that moment, we're not thinking logically, right? Because we're in shock. But if you can, that's where that conversation can be helpful. The fear and uncertainty about what your pet is going through does weigh on that decision-making process, because it's not easy to make this decision. And so, what kind of tolerance you have for knowing exactly when the right time is going to play into that. Worry can be very draining, especially when that worry is there over a long period of time. So that can totally play in. And whether you've had a previous euthanasia experience is also going to kind of dictate where you might fall or end up in the window. So statistically speaking, first-time pet owners are likely to wait longer, maybe too long, oftentimes ending up in an emergency room scenario. Now, this isn't unexpected. You've not been through this process before. You don't know what to expect. And if that was the case for you, in a previous experience, I would encourage you to give yourself some grace, because you didn't know, right? And so, if you've had that case where you ended up in the ER that first time because you hadn't been through it, you did the best you could with the information that you had. And it's important to keep that at the forefront of your mind. And so having a prior emergency is going to make you usually want to act a little sooner to avoid another emergency, right? And conversely, if you had a poor experience with a euthanasia in the past, then that may make you more inclined to wait longer as well, especially if there are unresolved feelings there, making the decision harder. So I'm going to share a little personal story with you. So my wife, Dr. Kendra, and I had a dog, Pooh Bear. Now, we've had Pooh Bear for as long as me and her were together, and this was kind of her soul dog, right? This was her baby. And he was a golden doodle with, he's about 13 or so. And as he got older, he started to develop some cardiac complications. And we tried to do our best to monitor. We tried to do our best to keep an eye on things. And I can tell you that we ended up uncomfortably close to ending up in an emergency room. And we did the same thing that owners do, where we're like, well, we've got her sister's coming back from living overseas, so we're going to wait till after that's done. After she gets back, then we'll make the decision. That way she can say goodbye, right? Or maybe we can do it, a month from now or whatever, right? We wrestle with these things. So why do I mention that? She deals with in-home euthanasia on a daily basis and helping owners navigate this. I talk to owners every day about navigating quality of life, about managing comfort, about things to think about, things to consider. All of these factors that I'm doing a presentation on here today, I talk about them on a daily basis. And despite that experience, despite that knowledge, the training that we've had, we ourselves nearly waited too long. So if it can happen to us, my friends, it can happen to anybody. And so again, if you've had that experience, please, please, please give yourself grace. Guys, this is hard. And there are a lot of things, nothing about this process is easy. And there are a lot of things that complicate these decisions, which is why we're talking about this today. Your social and family dynamics play into this because you're not making this decision in isolation. It is not uncommon for different decision makers, say a husband and its spouse, or a wife and her spouse, is to have disagreements about whether or not it's time or where they fall in the window. And we'll provide you some resources to kind of tackle that if that's something that you're going through later on when we get to kind of the navigating the in-between section of the webinar. But it's important to acknowledge that oftentimes the reason for these disagreements is because that family members just see different things. So one example I like to use is dementia, right? So if you work the morning shift and you're with your pet in the afternoon and evening, and your pet has dementia, and what you're seeing is as that sun starts to set, right, they start to get that sundowners, and some of those dementia symptoms start really rearing their ugly heads. And you're seeing this, and you're seeing the struggle, right, that your pet is going through. That's a different space. You're seeing things through a different lens than, say, your spouse who maybe works the overnight shift and is only with the pet in the morning, where, there's still these symptoms, but they're less frequent, right? And so it's not that either of you are inherently wrong, right? You're just viewing things from different points of view. You have a different lens that you're viewing this decision through. And that's what makes it challenging, right? And this is where, again, having these conversations and saying, hey, what are you seeing that maybe I'm not, can be really, really helpful in sort of starting that dialogue to find some consensus there. Social pressure plays in, especially judgment from others. Again, society's very, very quick to judge. And this is not only with regards to the decision itself, especially in cases like aggression or behavioral euthanasia, but this applies to grief as well. Had a good friend of mine put his cat down a few weeks back, and I was talking to him. This was a few weeks later after this had occurred, and I asked him, say, hey, how are you doing? How are you handling things? Is there anything I can do to support you? And he's like, no, I think I'm okay. But it was a little weird. I went back to work the next day, so the day after the euthanasia, and he goes, and my coworker was sharing these pictures with me from the Humane Society of all these cats. He shared like 10 pictures of cats from the Humane Society that were available for adoption. And he goes, and Mike, wouldn't you know, most of them looked like my pet. And gosh, right? Like the intent there was good. The coworker was trying to help, right? Maybe they didn't take the right approach, or maybe they didn't have the right tools to be able to help in a way that was meaningful, but the intent was good, right? They were trying. And oftentimes, especially when it comes to grief and loss, we don't talk about death enough as a society. And so when we're dealing with it with our pets, especially when you consider that pets mean different things to different people, it can get to a space where like it can be really difficult. I will tell owners, I heard this quote and I don't know where I heard it from, but there was this quote I once heard that said, like, nobody brings somebody a casserole when their pet dies, right? And to me, it just illustrates that disparity between how we as a society view grief with human loss, and compare that against how society kind of views grief from the loss of an animal. And the reality is that for the owner going through that loss, that grief can be just as strong, just as powerful, just as intense as the grief that they would have gone through when they lost a fellow human. And so that is really unfortunate that is the case, that society views it that way. And I would encourage you to, when you have friends or family that have lost their pets, to just reach out and talk to them. Is there anything that I can do? Is there anything that I can bring you? Is there anything I can do to help? Right. And take that approach rather than the more, I guess, typical approach that you see of this idea of like, hey, why aren't you over it yet? It's okay. Grief is a personal journey, and it's going to take you as long to navigate it as it's going to take. And it's okay if it takes longer for you than it does a friend of yours. All right. It's personal. On that, balancing that outside input is something that you sometimes have to do. And it's important, right? And like, we got Thanksgiving coming up this week. And so for most of us, we're going to have friends and family over at our house. And it's not uncommon, unfortunately, to have somebody, we're just going to say a cousin, that is going to be very quick to share their opinion on how your pet is doing, right? So they walk in the door and, oh man, look at Fluffy, he's looking real rough, right? And as an owner, you're going, hold on. What do you mean, right? Like, he's not doing too bad. I think it's important to acknowledge that, again, decline is gradual and it's easy to miss. So what your cousin is seeing in your pet is the change from 6 months ago to today, right? And what you see is typically the change from yesterday to today, right? Or last week from today. So it's much more gradual, much less evident. Now, just because that cousin that shares their opinion has some validity, right? Because of that, because of what they're seeing, and there's some validity there in what they're saying. But at the end of the day, you can't allow them and that external pressure to provide additional distress for yourself, right? Because at the end of the day, you are the one that's got to make this decision, and you are the one that's got to live with the decision. And so, just, don't be so quick to dismiss what they're saying, but also take in what they're saying with a big grain of salt. Timing and seasonality matters. And again, we talked about earlier with the disease and mobility, some conditions are going to worsen seasonally. There are some diseases that are going to get more difficult in the cold, such as mobility issues, and some diseases that are going to get a lot worse in the heat. I'm thinking cardiac or respiratory issues, right? So seasonality is going to play a role there. Life schedule, school year versus the summer, right? Vacations versus weddings or work commitments, or all of these things are things that you're, subconsciously or consciously thinking about when you're trying to figure out, hey, how do I make this decision, or when am I looking to make this decision? And it plays in because oftentimes, we want to try to wait until the kids are able to be home from school, or we're trying to wait to get them through the holidays. And it's normal, right? It's normal to struggle with decisions like this around special times. And holidays do allow people to be present that wouldn't otherwise be able to because they're somewhere else physically. So it is okay to say, hey, I want to try to get my pet through the holidays. But again, it's all about risk, right? Where, if you're going to do that, you have to also be okay that you might end up in a situation where you might not make it to the holiday. You may have to take him to an ER, or make the decision a little sooner or later, based on what you're seeing and how things are progressing. There's got to be some flexibility in that, right? So that way you can best prepare and plan. So that kind of plays in. There are ways, it's not the same, but there are ways that you can have people present, such as through virtual, like Zoom calls or things like that. Get them on FaceTime. It's not the same, but it still allows them to be there in some way. And then finally, like aftercare plans and what you'd like to do for that and how you want to handle that is going to play into that decision-making process. As we get into winter, if you're looking to bury on your property, and it's Wisconsin in winter, the ground's going to be pretty frozen, right? So it's okay to say, hey, listen, given that that's the case, and given that that's what I want to do after they have passed, that I'm going to have to make this decision, maybe earlier than you would otherwise because of that aftercare plans. Remember, guys, the window is that period of time. It's that spectrum where the decision is appropriate, ethically and medically. And so it's okay to fall anywhere within that window. And it's also okay to say that, hey, because of what's going on outside, the weather, that we're going to make this decision. It's not uncommon. What you're doing is you're managing risk, right? And you're adjusting and adapting to the situations that you find yourself in. So as you can see, the reason why I don't really like saying like, oh, you'll just know, or they'll tell you when it's time, is that this is inherently complicated, and there are a lot of things to factor in. And as I said, these things factor in whether you acknowledge them consciously or not. But they are things to think about. So by acknowledging them and just saying, hey, this is the situation that we kind of find ourselves in, it gives yourself a little more grace when you do make the decision, to know that you're making the right decision and you're doing right by your pet. So how do we navigate the in-between? How do we monitor our pet? How do we ensure that we are keeping them comfortable? Well, there are a couple of things that we can do. The most important thing that you can do is to do a quality of life assessment. Now, what is a quality of life assessment? Quality of life assessment is a tool. There are many of them out there. I'm actually going to send you, after this webinar, there are going to be some links in the email to some of these resources so that you have access to them, so you don't have to go find them. They're just there for you. But quality of life assessments allow you to take something that is somewhat nebulous, quality of life, and add some objectivity to it, some data to it. And it allows you to fill out this questionnaire that will help you gauge their quality of life. Now, one of the things that I often hear owners say is that, well, Mike, they're still eating and drinking, so their quality of life is good. Well, when we're thinking about quality of life, we're thinking about the whole animal, the entirety of the animal. And eating and drinking are life-sustaining biological functions. So for a lot of pets, they're going to continue to eat and drink until they're in the active dying phase. So eating and drinking should not be your sole judge, I should say, as to how your pet is doing. It is one factor among many to consider. So do these quality of life assessments, and I would encourage everybody to, even right now, regardless of where you are in your pet's life, do a quality of life assessment today. Because what that's going to allow you to do is to establish a baseline. Now, when you're doing these quality of life assessments, make sure you're being honest about it. Try to be as honest as you can as you're answering these questions, all right, so that you don't influence it inadvertently. But do it once a day and then track regularly. Okay, so how regularly should you track? Well, it kind of depends what feels right to you. I can tell you that like quality of life assessments are useful for pets of all ages. All right. Admittedly, when you're doing a quality of life assessment on a puppy, there aren't a lot of things in there that are going to negatively influence their quality of life. But it's still important to keep an eye on things. And so maybe for a younger dog or a younger cat, maybe once a year is plenty, just to keep, again, establishing this baseline, have an idea for kind of where we stand. As they progress further in the disease or age or whatever the problems are that are, they're battling with, you're going to find that you're going to want to do these quality of life assessments more regularly. Maybe that means monthly, maybe that means weekly, and maybe towards the end there, you're doing them on a daily basis. Again, what feels right to you? These quality of life assessments are also very, very useful for tackling disagreements between caregivers and family members, because again, it allows you fill them out independently. So you fill one out, your spouse fills one out independently, and then you compare the results. Because, oh, hey, I noticed that your movement category is really, really, really low, and I'm not really seeing that. So what are you seeing that I'm not? And oftentimes that may be like, hey, you're with them more on the weekend and you're able to monitor them throughout the day on the weekend. So maybe you're seeing some of these things that maybe the other spouse who only has a few hours with them during the day in the week is able to see. So these quality of life assessments are really, really good about sort of starting that dialogue to work towards some sort of consensus about, hey, where things are. And that could be a good sort of starting point for those conversations. I do want to mention Hospet. So in another life, I was a software engineer, and I created a free app on Android and iOS called Hospet. You can find it in the Android and app stores, completely free, no ads, no subscriptions, none of that. It allows you to not only track and monitor your pet's quality of life over time, and visualize kind of where that is on the graph, but it allows you to keep track of good days versus bad days, medical events, and that's really nice because like you can see like, hey, they vomited 3 times in the last week, and when you note that in the app, it asks you questions about that your vet is going to want to know. Dr. Kendra helped me create all of those events so that way the veterinarians are getting the information that they need to make better care decisions for your pet as well. So all completely free, useful tool, little shameless plug there for that. Into life care plans. So a quality of life assessment is about sort of analyzing what their quality of life is, but an end of life care plan is more what you would think of with regards to like an advanced care directive or a living will or something like that, where you're spelling out, this is what I want this to look like. So what actually are my goals? Let's get them in writing. What is the plan? Where do I want this to happen? Who do I want to be there? What do I want this to look like? What readings or prayers or songs do I want played? What does this look like? Who's there? And then not only that, but also what are we going to do if something changes? Sometimes we don't get the gift of this, for a lack of a better term, the gift, but this sort of gradual decline, right? Sometimes crises just happen, and we want to plan for that as well. It's okay to hope that they, get through the holidays, or I hope that they get better. I hope that they're having, many more good days. That's wonderful. And I hope that is the case too, but hope is not a plan. And so it's better to get a plan in place so that if you are in a crisis situation where now you're having to navigate this, you're not making these intense, scary decisions under that duress. You're able to make them while you're able to think clearly about those things. So end of life care plans, super, super helpful for spelling out exactly what it is that you want to get out of this experience, and what does this look like for you, your family, and your pet. Regular consultations with your primary vet are important. We talked a little earlier about how when you're given a diagnosis, there's a lot of shock there, and that shock can prevent us from thinking clearly and asking the questions that we need to ask. So follow up with your vet. It doesn't have to be an appointment. You can try sending them an email. You can call them and ask, hey, I've got these questions. What works best for me to get these questions answered for you guys? but follow up with your veterinarian. It's very, very important that when you're given a diagnosis, you're asking a couple of questions. First question, what does this look like, this progression of this disease or this cancer? What does this look like if I do nothing? So if we elect not to treat and we elect to just monitor and keep comfortable, what does the progression of this disease look like? And what does the time frame for this disease look like? Now, nobody's going to be able to tell you exactly how long. You're going to get a range. But it's still just to kind of have that information. Hey, what are we kind of looking at here? Are we looking at somewhere between 6 months to a year, a couple of years, a couple of months? What are we dealing with? Second question, what do the treatments look like for this disease? What do they cost? What are the side effects? What are the chances of success? Are these treatments curative or palliative? Are they keeping them comfortable? Or are they going to fix the problem? Right? These are all things that you want to ask so that you have all of the information that you need to then take that and weigh that against this decision-making process. So if you can't ask those questions in the moment, and nobody would fault you for not being able to ask those questions in the moment, follow up with your vet afterwards, schedule a follow-up appointment, shoot them an email, get the questions to the answers, get the answers to the questions that you need to make a good decision. And then finally, quality of life consultations. If you can do a quality of life consultation, that would be helpful. I'm not here to sell you our services. We do offer quality of life consultations where we provide a physical exam. We have an in-depth conversation with you in your home where we're able to monitor your pet in kind of their natural environment to help you seek clarity and guidance as well. You can certainly do that with your primary DVM as well if they're open to doing that. But again, the goal is to help provide clarity or supportive care measures or treatments that you can kind of pursue with your primary DVM. Because again, the idea is like if we can keep them as we want to keep them as comfortable as we can for as long as we can. And for a lot of owners, the decision to euthanize happens at a point where they are no longer able to guarantee a lack of daily comfort. So the disease has progressed such that, like, yes, they're having a good day today, but boy, what did they have to go through last night to get to that good day, right? And when that starts to become a regular thing that owners are kind of fighting with in their minds, that's where a lot of owners decide to make the decision, right? Because they're like, I just can't guarantee that I can keep you comfortable anymore. And when you aren't comfortable and when you are going through these episodes, they're so intense and so strong that it just doesn't feel right to me to allow you to go through that. So just some context there. Emotional monitoring and management, check in with yourself regularly. Things are going to change. And if you find yourself thinking about something on a regular basis, like there's some objection that you're having in your mind, like, is it too soon or what have you? Ask yourself, hey, what is this thought that I'm struggling with? And where might that be coming from? And that can often be helpful for you kind of self-analyzing and figuring out like, hey, maybe I had that bad experience in a prior euthanasia. And that didn't go the way I wanted. And I still got some of those unresolved feelings. So, that's kind of, maybe that's influencing the decision here, right? So asking yourself those open-ended questions can go a long way towards, helping you work through them. Check in with those involved in the decision and have those open dialogues around this conversation. As I said, if you've got multiple family members that have different opinions, fill out multiple quality of life assessments independently and compare the results, because people see different things based upon when they're around them. But don't hesitate to lean on fellow adults in your life, friends, family, neighbors, for that support if that's helpful. And the same thing could be said with children. Now, I'm not a child psychologist. I have no training in that. So I'm going to defer to the experts. But what I will say, the research that I have seen as it stands now is that it is important that you are honest about what's happening. And I think there's this very normal paternal instinct to try to shelter our kids from this decision-making process, whether they're young or even adult children. And again, normal, understandable. I am a parent. I get where that urge comes from. But the thing is that kids Kids notice more than we think. And they probably have those questions, but they don't know how to ask. And so sometimes just being honest and vulnerable, and you do what's right for you and your family, but being honest and vulnerable can allow your children to have the space, because you're modeling to them that, like, hey, this is hard for me too. You're sad, I'm sad too, right? And you can kind of help support them through that, because they're going to have those same feelings that you do, maybe in a different way. Now, children do grieve differently based upon ages, and we can do a whole webinar on that in and of itself. But, the biggest thing is, be honest, be supportive, and normalize what you're feeling. For a lot of children and a lot of young adults, the death of a pet is the first time that they are going through this experience, the experience of death, the experience of that loss. And so it's very normal for it to be a tumultuous time for them, and to be a time where they have a lot of questions, and some of those questions are hard to deal with because you're also going through your own stuff, right? So I'm not saying that it's easy. I'm not saying that there's no challenge there. All I'm encouraging is to just be open and honest with them, and give them the space to share what they're feeling, so that you can help them and support them through that. Most importantly, seek emotional support if you need it. You do not have to wait until after the death has occurred to seek emotional support. Okay, we talked about this. Anticipatory grief is a very real thing, and it can be just as difficult to manage that grief as it is after the loss. All right, so whether that help comes in the form of family, friends, or mental health professionals, seek it if you need it, and give yourself the grace and the permission to ask for that help. It's not a failing, all right? It's actually a sign of strength to be like, hey, listen, this is just a lot for me to deal with right now. I need some outside support. So guys, there are no perfect moments here when we're making this decision. It's only a window of time where the decision to euthanize is medically and ethically appropriate. And as we talked about, there are a lot of factors. This is complicated. And we touched on a lot of these factors, even very low level, right? There are a lot of factors here that influence this decision-making process. And it's important to know that whether you decide earlier in the window or later in the window, neither of those decisions are right or wrong. Both carry different risks, both carry different benefits. It's all about what's going to work best for you and your family. But if you can understand the influences that you're dealing with anyway, then that's going to just help you make a more intentional, values-aligned decision. Most importantly, and I'll share my contact information after we get to the Q&A section here next. Most importantly, I want you to know that you don't have to utilize our services to get some support. If you need to talk, please, please, please reach out. We know how hard this is. We know how difficult this is. And we firmly believe in making sure that every owner, whether you use this or don't, making sure that they have the support that they need. So never, ever hesitate to reach out. I'm wishing you guys peace as you navigate this decision, and know that we're here for you in whatever way you may need. So with that, what questions do we have? All right, got one question here. We talk a little more about natural death. Sure. The biggest thing I would think to emphasize with that is just that, the choice to pursue a natural death is an active choice. And as I alluded to earlier, it does take a lot of effort to ensure that we're going about that appropriately. Nobody wants their pet to suffer. I mean, that's obvious, right? But it is a lot to manage that, and it is a lot to stay on top of. And so what I would encourage is that if you're looking to pursue that as an option, have a conversation with your vet and let them know, and figure out, like, hey, is there a way that we can do this in a way that both respects my wishes for a natural death, but also ensures that I'm keeping my pet comfortable as well. All right, any other questions that I can help answer? After our pet's put to sleep, what are our options for dealing with their body? Sure. So this is pretty standard, depending. where you are kind of depends on exactly what your options are, but you have typically 3 options when it comes to aftercare. All right. So the first is usually a home burial, where you choose to bury on your property. There are cremation options available. There's typically 2. The first of which is the cremation with no return of ashes. Oftentimes it's called a communal cremation, because your pet is cremated with other pets, electing that communal cremation. And so with the communal cremation, it is a way for them to care for the body without there being any ashes returned back to you. I do want to say that I have had some owners feel like they've got to justify that decision for a group cremation. It's okay to not want ashes returned back to you. It's not a reflection of your love. It's just a personal preference. Some people want that, some people don't, and either way is okay. And then the other option is a private cremation, and this is where your pet is typically cremated privately, with the return of ashes. And so that is typically your 3 options there. In some states, we do have options for like aquamation, which is cremation with water, alkaline hydrolysis specifically, but that isn't something that is available as far as I know in Wisconsin, due to some of the laws that kind of surround that. But those are your typical options there. Are there any other questions that I can help answer for you guys? No? All right, guys. Well, here's my contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out. If you think of questions, you can always email, text, give us a call, whatever's going to work best for you. Like I said, I know how hard this decision is for you guys, and I want to make sure that you have the support that you need. So if there's anything that I can do to support you, even if that's just to talk, please don't hesitate to reach out. You guys and your family are in our thoughts.